Welcome to the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Jonelle Elgaway. And now, Dr. Kline and Jonelle Elgaway.
Good evening and welcome to the Doctor's Corner on CAW360 Network with host Dr. Kline and I'm Jonelle Elgaway. There are two ways to listen into tonight's program, either through website www.caw360network.com and click on Listen Here and the play button, or YouTube channel The Doctor's Corner. Please make sure to like and subscribe to all our YouTube channels on CAW360 Network to get notifications of when shows are live. Tonight we will be focusing on addiction and giving you a preview of new upcoming show called Dr. Tom and the Dope Fiends. Before we get into tonight's show, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Dr. Kline. How are you this evening, Dr. Kline?
I'm just dandy.
Good to hear. Is there anything newsworthy that you would like to share with us?
There's huge news. Our show currently we talk about both addiction and pain because both people take opiates, and opiates have been demonized. Anybody who takes opiates is a devil worshiper. Whether or not you have addiction or you have pain, you're both seen the same way. So what's happened? We've had two federal agencies in the last week, the CDC and FDA, come out and say that tapering is horribly wrong. People are dying. People are going to the streets to purchase their medicines, and it needs to stop. The CDC that started all this with its opiophobia, the director said that the only people that should be tapered are patients who wish to be tapered or agree to be tapered. That's huge. The FDA is a much stronger statement. They're going to relabel all their opiates with warnings not to suddenly taper. They have not caught on to the fact that people are also being tapered abruptly from benzodiazepines, antidepressants, and anticonvulsants like Lyrica and Neurontin, both of which can cause very nasty withdrawals, including seizures. So hopefully they'll catch on to this too. For 3 years, we've had the worst tragedy in American history, and they've finally caught on. So this is a big deal. The ship is going to start turning, and I think when the ship turns, it's going to turn with all its little boats. And that covers addiction. It covers the treatment of addiction. It covers the treatment of pain. I think things are going to start to change. And so that's big, big positive news. Jonelle?
Okay, that's wonderful. We have a few mailbag questions. The first one is how can I find out if my state will compensate my PCP for palliative care?
Palliative care is not billable in itself. It's like saying, okay, you have cardiac disease, so you will need some cardiac care. So you just write that in your chart as a diagnosis, but you don't get paid just to write that in there. But you do get paid for all the stuff that's involved. And for chronic pain, there is a wonderful billing system, Medicare's great gift to primary care doctors called Chronic Care Management, CCM. For the first time, Medicare has allowed us doctors to bill when the patient's not in the room. That's a big deal. So if I have to get on the pharmacy for 30 minutes, arguing over prescriptions, I can bill for that. If the patient calls me and is having trouble, I can bill for that. If I have a nurse practitioner and she's out seeing somebody and we can bill for that. So this is potentially a couple, $200-300 extra a month. It would be for me, but I refuse to take the government's electronic medical record because I wanted to have my patients private, and so I don't get to do that. So I'm not saying this selfishly, but this is something that we can teach the doctors, and pretty soon I'm going to publish a little blurb on you can take to your doctor on teaching them how to make more money. And part of the problem that doctors don't like with chronic pain is the problem with the pharmacies and time spent. I've got just a few patients and I'm on the phone every single day. with difficulties. So next, another question?
Yeah. Oh, oops. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know if you ever got to look over it, but someone was wondering if you could weigh in on the letter from the 38 United States AGs to HHS Chronic Task Force pushing back on the recommendations to reevaluate the flawed CDC guidelines.
That's a lot. Half are Republicans, but there's a bunch of Democrats in there too. So what we're seeing is pervasive fear of addiction phobia. It's still there. The letter also said that, quote, anyone can become addicted. Okay, so that's going to be the subject of our show tonight because that's actually not true. And so the attorney generals are practicing medicine. Anyone can become addicted? That's a medical issue. It's funny how all these folks like to become the moral drivers of medical practice. I'm having trouble writing prescriptions today because they can be on paper and they can't be faxed and they can't mail the prescriptions to the patients and they can't do a lot of other things. And they believe that this substance control prevents addiction. Guess what? It doesn't.
I'm also hearing quite a few people, their health insurance isn't covering oxycodone 30 milligrams instant release any longer. Do you have anything to...
The insurance companies are just running away with the permission from the CDC to basically get rid of opiates, and then they don't have to pay for them. You see, pain medicines are pretty expensive, except for oxycodone. That's pretty cheap. You can usually get away with about $100 a month if you have to pay for it out of pocket. So the insurance companies need to come under congressional review and state reviews. Insurance companies are licensed in each state. Remember, licensing is the key to getting things done, licensing agencies. If you think I'm a crummy doctor, you go to my board of registration that licenses me, and they'll look into it. Same thing with an insurance company. They're all licensed to practice their craft in the state. So if they're doing the wrong thing, we need to talk to our legislators, and I think they'll listen. I think this is cruelty in order to make more profits. The insurance company gets monthly fees from everyone into a big pool. And then, if they don't fill prescriptions, they get to keep the money. And they all divide it up at the end of the year with huge bonuses. Talk to your state reps.
Do you remember the palliative care code? What is it again?
It's Z51.5.
Okay.
And remember, you're not. If the doctors submit that, they're not going to get paid. You have to submit the time you're spending, the rest of the visits, and blah blah.
Okay. Somebody else sent in also, and this is just more of a comment. The DEA website on opioids makes an embarrassingly false claim in the first half of the first sentence at DEA.gov. An opioid is always a narcotic. A narcotic isn't always an opioid. They said they thought we would be amused.
Yeah, that's practicing medicine. They don't have a license to do that.
Okay. Well, tonight we have guests Kira and Craig that are here to teach us what addiction is and share all their knowledge on the subject. They will also be a part of the panel on Dr. Tom and the Dope Fiends. Welcome, Kira, and welcome, Craig. How are you both this evening?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you. Are you there, Craig?
Hey, Jonelle. I'm doing well, thanks. Yep.
Good. All right. I know Dr. Kline wanted to talk a little bit about addiction quickly before we start asking questions.
The thing that I've noticed as a practicing physician is that it appears that addiction falls into two different groups, a type 1 and a type 2. I'm not involved with addiction medicine. I'm not involved with people with addiction disease. So what we've done is we've asked two experts to come on to the show and help us figure this out. So this is a problem-solving, figuring it out thing. What I've kind of hypothesized in my mind is an answer to the question why we have spent $1,000 billion, that's $1 trillion, on the drug wars, and we've made no progress. How come we keep reading that everything is worse than it was, the sky is falling in? I think the answer is the failure to understand the medical issues surrounding addiction. It's like diabetes. There's two kinds of diabetes. There's a diabetes that starts in children, and there's a diabetes that starts in adults, type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Very different diseases. They look alike. They both involve glucose. So the same thing I've noticed with addiction, and my hypothesis is that addiction itself is a word that always needs to be modified. If somebody comes to me and says, Dr. Kline, I have diabetes, my next question is, which type? So the same thing with addiction. We develop all these government programs to take care of addiction, but there's two different types, I think. So type 1, the first type, is the type that people seek out medicine, drugs on the street in order to feel better. Kelsey Grammer said the reason he took drugs when asked made me feel better. So these are the big four: marijuana, 95% of alcohol, cocaine, and methamphetamine and / stimulants, because they're all kind of in the same group. And what it appears to me, and we need to have some validation of this, is that this first group can reach a point of addiction. And I've decided that all the definitions of addiction and opioid misuse and everything are just not good enough. So my definition of type 1 addiction is involvement with a substance to the detriment of your daily life. If you go out and drink 49 beers on the weekend and crash and you're unconscious, and you get up Monday and go to work and your family is fine and everything is fine in your life, you don't have addiction. Now, the people that run these huge addiction clinics and addiction agencies, and we Americans have an agency called Substance Abuse Agency, they're not going to like this, but that's the way it is. A disease is ill at ease. So if, one example, a kid was smoking marijuana every single day for 2 years, dropped out of college, didn't have any good friends, did he have addiction? He did, because it was detrimental to his daily life. And you know that because he went to rehab. Type 1 addiction folks are very sensitive to rehab. Rehab works. Talk rehab works here. So he had talk rehab, and he stopped, settled his problems, went on, graduated from college, etc. So in this group, this first group, separating out marijuana, alcohol, speed, and cocaine are the drugs associated with serious bodily harm type crime, assaults, rapes, murders, etc. When they studied this in prisons, they found out that alcohol was the worst. Next came cocaine and methamphetamine tied, because in type 1, you can have personality change. You can really turn into a dope fiend. You really can, because you're now crazy and running around and beating up and killing people. And that can happen with those 3 drugs, because they're known to change your personality. That's type 1. Type 2 addiction are addictions that are hardwired in the brain, are associated with receptors, and there's 3 types. One is opioid addiction, heroin addiction. Number 2 is nicotine addiction. And the third is 5% of alcoholics who need to have alcohol in their bloodstreams at all times and who go through the DTs when they withdraw. So type 2 addictions all are hardwired in the brain. All 3 have withdrawal syndromes. You can quit in type 1. You can just stop. Most people don't want to. But in type 2 addictions, you cannot just stop. You can't. And people say, why can't you? And the answer is, I can't. Because it's a brain receptor addiction. My brain receptors are taking over. So you can see how, if you start to look at this as two different addictions, you can see how things become confused. A lot of people think that people on heroin are hardcore criminals. And that's because the famous movie Reefer Madness in 1936 portrayed people on narcotics, murderers, people running over each other on the street, shootings with guns, seduction, rape, and going mad, going crazy. But the narcotic they were talking about was marijuana. So they got the wrong drug. So when somebody says, oh, you know what, he's on drugs, it really depends on which drug. So in type 2 addiction, there's an odd thing that happens in your receptors. 0.5% of people in the world have a stray gene, a gene abnormality that makes it so when you take an opiate, your normal system of feeling good goes crazy. It's 1,000 times more than it's supposed to be. It runs in families. It is a disease that you can see on special, what are called PET scans. You can see the abnormal receptors. It's definitely genetic. And that's because the incidence of the disease of 0.5%, which it is now, is the same as it was in 1920 and 1950, 1970. Any year that you pull up and you just look up number of heroin addicts and divide it by the population, and lo and behold, it always comes out to 0.5%. So it cannot be created by substance exposure, which is the latest and the thing that's been driving all of the war on drugs ever since it began. And by the way, heroin addiction began in 1915 when the government passed a law trying to restrict opiates, and so everybody just headed to the street and used heroin because it was cheaper and it worked better than morphine. So the government starts this in 1915 and then runs around trying to blame it on. I mean, I made a list the other day of things they've blamed it on. It's about a foot long. So we start to see now that with these two types of addictions, it starts to explain things. For example, why don't heroin addicts frequently commit serious bodily harm crime? Because in heroin addiction, your personality does not change. You cannot create a toxic psychosis with heroin. You certainly can with the other big three, and the most frequent is alcohol. You've seen it. You've seen how people's personalities change when they're on too much alcohol. They suddenly become abusive, start beating up people, beating their children and their wife and their friends. Those are the dangerous addictions. So the hardwired addictions that really have no personality change, and crime is pretty much limited to shoplifting and that sort of thing, but very rarely ever beating up somebody or doing serious crime. So we're going to start calling the type 2 heroin addict as the real disease that it is. It's a disease of the chemical receptors in the brain. It's nobody's fault. It just happens. It's a weird but a real genetic disease. And soon there's going to be a genetic test to prove all this. In the meantime, we just have to go on the data that we have, which is 700 papers written by some pretty serious scientists to show that opiate addiction is clearly an abnormality of the receptors in the brain. So we're going to call this chemical receptor disease instead of dope fiends or heroin addicts. I mean, the word addict is really a pejorative term. It's like all the other nasty terms we call people that we feel prejudice against. So we have two people on as experts today who have the genetic disease of receptor disease, genetic disease of opiate addiction. Both of these people have been on heroin. So neither one of them is on heroin now, and we're going to talk to them to try to learn more about this disease, just like we used to talk to people about diabetes to learn more about the disease. We have this huge program, $5 billion this year, to address the opioid crisis of overdose deaths that are occurring totally in the addiction community. 500 people die a year in the office practices, and it looks like 30,000 or 40,000, whatever the latest CDC figures are. Those people dying that the CDC reported are dying when they have untreated opiate addiction or receptor disease, because people in these communities do not receive medical care. So that's why we want to chat with Kira and with Craig about the impact of this disease. So, Kira, when did your disease first manifest, if you could recall?
Well, I started my addiction when I was like 16, but I think probably being prescribed Adderall at a young age is really what kind of unlocked it all.
Okay. And explain more. How did that then lead to the first? Go ahead.
Well, I didn't really know anything about drugs at that point. So when people found out that I was taking Adderall and they said they would give me money for it, I was like, okay. And then when people were busting it out snorting, I realized like, oh, okay, I see. People get high on this stuff and it makes them feel good. And that just kind of opened up a pathway to more people that I probably shouldn't have been around, I guess, which kind of leads one thing to the next.
Okay, and then when was your first trip to the moon? Magic carpet ride.
Actually, I went to rehab for weed. My mom put me in there, and that's where I learned about heroin. And so when I got out, being in rehab, I had learned all of the slang for it. I learned about the dope spots. I learned about the trap houses. I learned about streets in Chicago. I mean, just everything that I shouldn't have known. So when I got out, I was at a party and I heard someone talk about, let's go to the spot. And instantly my head went back to rehab when they were like, oh, if you like drinking, you would love heroin. So I went up to them. I was like, oh, hey, you guys talking about dope? And they're like, oh, what'd you know about that? And that was it. That was the first time I tried it.
What was alcohol like for you prior to this time?
You know, I mean, I drank because my friends did, and I wanted to fit in and have fun at parties and stuff in high school. But I don't know. Heroin's the only thing that, like, I couldn't ever stop on my own.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Like,
Sure. So when you drank alcohol, did you really get a buzz? Did you feel high? Did you feel euphoric?
I pretty much just felt drunk and dizzy, and
okay.
Yeah, it wasn't that fun for me. I didn't really like drinking.
Okay. So when you tried heroin for the first time at 16, did you inject, snort it?
I snorted it for the first couple of months.
Okay.
And it didn't give me the same, when I snorted it and when I shot it, it was like doing two different drugs. Like when I snorted it, I was numb. I had a body buzz. I felt good. But it wasn't until I shot it when I was like, oh my God, like this is how I want to feel 24/7, you know?
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more what it's like, because the reason I'm asking you is the majority of people, 99.5% of people, when they take any opiate, whether it be heroin or whatever, and by the way, heroin in pill forms is about the same as oxycodone. The rest of the world that doesn't have this bad gene or gene abnormality when they take an opiate, they just feel a little relaxed, and you kind of smile. And I had IV morphine in the hospital once, and it made me feel weird. So when you had intravenous heroin, what was it like? Was it, we say a magic carpet ride. Do you think that's a fair way to put it, or?
I think when you said going to the moon, I think that's the best way to put it. It's just,
okay.
As soon as it goes in you, you just feel it literally going through all of your veins, and it just gives you this warm, fuzzy hug, and everything you just kind of go back, and you're just in Wonderland. Nothing is bothering you. You're not thinking about any of your problems. It's a very numbing feeling, but at the same time, you're extremely happy. The euphoria is great. But then you kind of get into your addiction and things change.
Kira, did you know your behavior was different from others that were doing this?
I thought I was just a rebelling teenager. I just thought I was trying to just kind of hide the pain. I didn't realize how bad it was going to get and how fast it got bad. And that's when I realized.
Were you around other people that tried heroin and then just stopped and think it was that big a deal?
Yeah, I actually had overdosed. I was in a coma for, I think, just under a week or something, because the people I was with left me. And, it just kind of, from there, everything just went south. It was like, they quit. They're like, you were dead on our couch. Like, why do you want to get high again? And I'm like, man, I'm fine. I'm here. I'm alive. And I couldn't understand why they didn't want to get high again. But they woke up and saw me blue on their couch, foaming at the mouth, completely pissed and shit myself, like completely purple, dead, and I just didn't understand why they didn't want to get high anymore.
And did they not?
No, they didn't.
Okay, so in trying to learn this, and we're going to ask Craig to chime in a minute, the fact that you're going to the moon meant that you, as we're postulating, have these abnormal genes that hopefully we're going to be able to test, is different than all the other people who could just stop.
Mm-hmm.
Craig, what do you think about this?
We've spoken before at length, and I believe, I was type 2, from the start. I didn't start with opiates or heroin. My first experience was when I was 14 with alcohol. But yeah, to the moon. That's it's exactly how I would describe it. I actually even wondered why people who had access to alcohol, adults basically, weren't drinking it all the time. As a kid, I couldn't understand that. In other words, I thought, if something feels this good, why wouldn't you want to do it 24/7? And that was my mentality. And so, and I thought that kind of odd, because I didn't notice that in the people that were around me. The people that I was drinking with, they seemed like, they were maybe out on a Friday or Saturday night at a party, or, maybe before a football game or something. And, it was more of like a, social lubricant for them. They might, drink a little bit too much and get tipsy and stuff like that. But for me, it was like the driving force. It became like my solution to life at the time.
Yeah.
And,
So
that just progressed.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, that just progressed, every time. I thought that would be enough for me, alcohol by itself. But the first time I was exposed to marijuana, I thought that was the most amazing thing ever too, and I just kept doing that, and like Kira had mentioned, once you start down that path, people just start showing up. It's not as if I was seeking it, or there were people out there trying to sell it to me. It was, I was at a party and I was drinking and smoking, and then someone showed up and they had some cocaine. So I did it. The education that I had gotten in school said all drugs are bad. They're horrible. Don't do it. It's really dangerous. And they never described, my reality this is amazing, So I didn't believe any of the education at that point just kind of went all out the window for me. And I just kept doing that. And eventually, that same thing happened with heroin. And then that moonshot basically just was way above all the rest of them for me personally.
So like with Kira, now how was it with cocaine, Craig? Did you get this super going to the moon with cocaine experience?
No, I didn't. I mean, I eventually, and that was the thing, is I, was initially snorting it, and I did that for a while, and then someone said, hey, you can smoke that. And so I would smoke it, and that was a little bit more intense. And then someone said, oh, hey, you can inject that. And I was like, okay, let me try that, So, I never, got that moonshot, but I was around people that were doing that all the time. And so that was what was available, and that's what I did. And the other drugs are always just around. And so, whatever was available is what I would do. But, my first love was alcohol, and that ended when I did heroin for the first time.
So the heroin was better than the alcohol?
Absolutely.
A lot better.
Without a doubt.
Okay, and in Kira's case, she didn't like alcohol at all. So what we're thinking is that alcohol cross-reacts with the mu receptors that are in charge of the heroin addiction. We're not quite sure why, but it isn't always. In your case, Craig, obviously it was very intense, enough to get you started into the drug culture. And the next question I wanted to ask both of you is about the culture. And before we do that, Jonelle, do you have a couple of questions? We have kind of a list here to ask, and we're sort of sharing.
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering, did you realize that you had an issue or an addiction, or was it just, did you think that you were like everybody else?
For me, I knew I was gonna have an addiction if I didn't already. Like, I mean, my story is just, that's why I laughed, because my story is just like Craig's, the same thing, even with the cocaine, going from snorting and then, smoking and being like, oh, this is great. And then the next one, so I feel like our stories are just so much alike. And I don't know if that's just everybody for type 2, but that's why I laughed. I just kind of wanted to say that really quick.
Well, this is one of the most important things that we're looking for, and anybody that who has type 2 addiction. The key thing is that it's not substance sensitive. In other words, if we remove 99% of all these bad substances, people are still going to addict because it only takes a little bit. And this is the story that we read in the paper that's got everybody so scared. Teenager injures his foot, goes to the doctor, and the next you hear they're dead from a heroin overdose. The doctor caused the addiction. Well, what happened was the kid went and got some Vicodin or Percocet, and after 2 or 3 tablets, then the definition of intense seeking without consequence that actually Craig and I came up with together. And I think it's a great short kind of definitive definition of type 2 addiction. So I read an article the other day from 1916. This was a year after the Harrison Act, a year after they started arresting doctors for treating addiction. The police decided that doctors should not treat addiction. They didn't think it was a disease. They thought it was a moral problem. And guess where the word moral shows up today? In the DEA diversion regulations. It actually says moral issues. So the police decided, and that started the heroin epidemic in 1915. Not 1999 when CDC started collecting data. Funny how things started that year. So we are testing the hypothesis that if type 2 opiate addiction starts with just a few substances, a few pills, a little bit of alcohol, that it's triggering the addiction, not causing it. After Prohibition, they did some studies and they found out that they may actually have reduced some bad alcohol behaviors. Probably not the 5% in the type 2, but the bad alcohol behaviors. So in other words, in that time, controlling substance or substance exposure hypothesis is true. So in other words, substance control is true for type 1, but it's a waste of time for type 2. And the majority of our drug war right now is, of course, opiates and dope fiends. So we need additional data. We're collecting as much as we can. I have about 25 so far of addicted folks that or receptor disease. Let's start using that word, RDs. Everyone appears to have started immediately on a small amount. One guy I talked to the other day said he started on Vicodin when he was 16, and he said he didn't really start intense seeking for a while. He just took the Vicodin. And I said, well, what was it like? And he said, I got energized. That's a danger signal. So what we're also thinking about is having some old-fashioned education. You know, they didn't teach about sex education, and all these young women went off and died from abortions. And it's interesting, Craig, about when teachers fib to you. I remember talking to a teenager, and she said, you know, the reason we're having so much sex is because everybody told us to avoid it, and we just assumed it wasn't fun. As soon as they found out it was fun, then they went, you liars, you know, and then you lose trust. And so you just go out and have a lot of sex, or you go out and just try all kinds of drugs. So we're thinking that we need to have some kind of like basic sex education about drugs. Like, okay, if you feel like this, that's not normal. And having folks like you explaining what it's like. And Craig, I had a guy, or Kira, I had a guy in Portland, Oregon, who was a receptor disease person. And he said, I just don't understand why everybody doesn't do this. It's really wonderful.
Hey,
nobody
Dr. Kline,
told us it was wonderful. Yep, go ahead.
There's a lot of people saying on the YouTube chat that they've been euphoric from when they've had pain relief, like when their pain is lower. Is that the same thing as an addiction, or is that just your body feeling better and you have energy?
Okay, well, that's why it's not good to have euphoria in the definition. The definition is intense seeking without regard for consequence. So if a person feels relieved from their pain, do they go on then and intensely seek more pain medicine? No, usually not. But feeling euphoric with pain relief, feeling euphoric after your baby's born, women have the highest levels of their own opiates or endorphins after they give birth. And somebody said once, okay, that's great, give that a 10. That's really the highest there is, you know, after you give birth. Heroin is 1,000. That was the comparison to try to make people understand. So that kind of euphoria is okay. I mean, I get euphoria eating donuts, you know, and I just don't consider myself a type 2 addict. Maybe type 1, but so euphoria is okay unless it becomes to the point that you begin intense seeking.
So this could be like with food too, like sugar.
Sure, of course. Or anything that you really enjoy, you know, anything you really enjoy. You know, if you enjoy music, I mean, you know, Craig loves, he told me before, he loves to go to concerts, and, you know, you can get euphoric from that. You can even, you know, get a little dopamine going, you know, and flush and have a good time. So perfectly okay. But we traditionally in our country don't like people to get high. You know, I get high on donuts, Craig gets high on concerts. Why is it that the government is so afraid of people getting high?
Well, and I was wondering, Craig and Kira, how has society treated you once, you know, the label of addiction came with your name?
Well, I mean...
Oh, go ahead, Craig.
Oh,
Craig,
yeah, I was
Craig,
going to say, yeah, I tried to hide it as best I could. And so,
what did you do to hide it? How did you hide it? Like, what are the things that you did?
Okay. Well, I mean, like while I was actively using heroin, I tried to just maintain my normal life, which any heroin addict will tell you is a very difficult thing to do because, you know, heroin is basically a 24/7 operation. So, you put all of your time and energy into that. And, you know, in my case, you know, I had to put a lot of extra effort in trying to maintain a facade at work. Like, and it was just going to work was a huge deal. And if I didn't have heroin beforehand, then I was going to be late, you know, and so I was going to need to come up with some kind of excuse, some believable thing about why I'm an hour and a half late to work. Yeah. And I've been literally just, you know, in my car sitting on a side street waiting for someone to show up.
Oh, God, I'm sorry. I was just wondering, does it get to a point though that like you're just wanting to be okay, like normal, not sick, and that's why you're doing it, or what is that like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, after the initial moonshot, so, you know, like Kira, I snorted it actually only for the first few days because having history as an IV drug addict, or I was, you know, using cocaine intravenously, I, you know, immediately wanted to do that with heroin. I thought, well, if it makes me feel this good when I snort it, it'll be just that much better if I inject it. And, you know, that first high is not something that I was ever really able to recapture. And I really tried to recapture it as best I could. And, you know, eventually as I became physically addicted to it, in other words, you know, I got to a point where after a few hours, I would literally start to get sick, you know, what we called, you know, being dope sick, which is just a horrible thing. It's, you know, a lot of anxiety, you know, stomach issues, you know, your eyes are watering, you're yawning, it's very flu-like symptoms, and very intense. And so, you know, and just another shot of heroin will immediately take care of that. I mean, literally, like, I could have mucus running out of my nose, and the moment I get high, it just stops, literally at the second.
Really? Wow.
So, yeah, and so while you're sick, it's very difficult to function. Very difficult to function. In other words, it's pretty obvious that there's something wrong with you if anyone sees you while you're sick. And so my goal was to have heroin 24/7, which is a very difficult thing to do, especially if you're not, you know, ultra wealthy, like I'm not. And so I did the best I could to try not to be sick. And literally, like, if I wanted to work, and you know, Dr. Kline, you'd mentioned about that gentleman who got that energy. So in addition, if you're sick and you do heroin, then it gives you the energy to do something. You know, maybe it's, you know, walk your dog or go to work or make a phone call or just, you know, basic day-to-day activity. Whereas if you don't have it, at least for me, you know, I'm on the floor curled up in a ball, you know, incapable of really doing anything.
Meredith Lawrence, that was on Fox News, she said a comment, and I wonder if you agree with this. She said, you know, if you're a patient and you take pain medication, it makes you better. If you are you have issues with addiction and you take pain medication or opioids or whatever, and it makes you worse, then you know that you're going to have an addiction. Is that true? Like, so if you have issues with it, then it does make you worse?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I won't touch a pain pill. Like, I'll go to Kratom or something, you know, before I go to any opiate, because my brain doesn't know the difference between a bag and a pill. All it knows is that it's getting that happy feeling, and it wants to go back to what it knows, and it wants to have that those opiates flowing through your veins 24/7, and just starts the addiction or the obsession all over again in your head. You know, and that's why I think so many people are reaching out to alternatives such as Kratom, CBD, different herbs like that, even weed, because of the fact that, you know, some of us with the type 2 addiction, we know that we can't take those opiates. So we try to go to other things that'll help, you know.
So have either of you been on substitution treatment with other opiates like methadone or Suboxone? Kira?
Mm-hmm.
You have?
Yeah, that's how I got off heroin. I went from heroin to methadone, and then I got off methadone with Kratom.
Okay, so one of the things that we're thinking to define type 2 addiction is that it's probably lifelong because it involves the receptors in your brain. I used to smoke cigarettes, and, you know, when I'm around somebody smoking, I just love the smell, you know. In other words, it's still there. You know, it's not as intense, but it's still there. So I'm thinking that these are lifelong disorders, and being a chronic and rare disease specialist, I'm beginning to think we should be looking at these as chronic diseases. Receptor disease is a chronic disease. And, everybody says, well, why don't you just stop? Well, why don't you just stop drinking water after 3 days? Just forget it, And, I practiced medicine for 40 years, and you know how many people change their shapes? About 3. So what's the matter with these people trying to go on these diets? How come they can't stop eating? It's that kind of mentality. And I think if we look at this as a chronic disease and, maybe even think of using the words like remission, that you're in remission, which indicates, that you've got a long-term disease. Alcoholics know that. Now, remember, only 5% of alcoholics really have type 2 disease. So, but one of the things that's starting to strike home is all 3, nicotine, 5% alcoholics, and opiates, you have to have a continuous blood level. Because if you don't, receptors don't like that, and they want more, and then you start going through withdrawal, like Craig says. Interesting little side story. I have a patient who has a rare disease, very, very painful rare disease, that every time she eats, she gets horrible, horrible pains. Been going on for years. So we started treating her because of another situation with intravenous dilaudid, and she got great control. And then she reported that a couple times a month she kept getting colds. Runny nose, not feeling good. And this was happening twice a month. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, adults don't get colds twice a month. Little kids age 2. And guess what? She was starting to withdraw when her blood level got a little too low. So her blood level was kind of fluctuating, and she was having withdrawal. It was mild because she still had some. So the big question for me as a doctor and sort of a biochemist is, can we find a level in people with receptor disease where we can just keep them away from withdrawing? In other words, I should have, with this woman, had I realized that, it just dawned on me, that I should have raised her dose a little bit. Probably wouldn't have changed her pain medicine much, but it would have kept her from going into these little sags and having this withdrawal. So, Craig and Kira, do you think it's possible to replace the medicine, forget what it is? In the UK, they use heroin. I mean, you can use any opiate. That you could find a level where it took care of the withdrawal symptoms, and then kind of fix a dose. And if you wish to take substitution treatment, like you did, Kira, with the methadone, that you could do an exact thing. And I don't know. Do you think that seems reasonable, Craig?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. And I think for some people that may be the only option for them. In other words, they may have tried other methods and been unsuccessful. I was in a circumstance where that just really wasn't an option. And so I kind of just had to make do with. So
you went sober without anything. So
right, but if somebody had said, "Hey, can I at least taper you with something?" I would have jumped at the chance for sure. And again, I was in a situation where there were a bunch of people trying to help me out, and and I was willing to accept that help, and and I wanted to get out of that lifestyle. I knew that wasn't something that I could continue successfully in my mind, simply because I just didn't have enough money to have heroin 24/7. Right. So in other words, to me, that was, like success. Like if I had enough money to get enough, then I would be okay. But that kept not happening. The reality was different for me every time. In other words, I'd run out of money, run out of resources, and then I would be sick. I recognized that pattern.
Yeah, let me throw this out there. Does our government, do they think that addiction could just be stomped out and over with? So and that's why they don't want to create these programs, because I don't know.
President Trump says if we just cut back to manufacturing of opiates, then we won't have any more addictions.
But then they'll go to somewhere else, right?
Well, and not only that, but 95% of the production of opiates goes to treating pain. So, so that's a pipe dream, to use a little analogy. It's not going to work because, see, you have to go back to the basic idea that substance exposure may be true for type 1, but it is not true for type 2 because you only need a little bit. So, in other words, does Vicodin lead to heroin addiction? Yeah, it's the first step in triggering the addiction. The first step in becoming overweight is a donut. One donut starts it off. So you see, we've got these myths. And I think if people understand the type 1 and type 2, type 1 being substance exposure, type 2 not being substance exposure, but being triggered genetically, the whole drug war collapses. Although, if they do want to continue working on cocaine and methamphetamine, I mean, these are drugs that people choose to use. And I see type 2 as being triggered not necessarily by people choosing it, they just happened onto it. Now, they may choose it as like they would cocaine, but it's a different circumstance. Or cocaine, you really do choose it to feel better. With type 2 addictions, you choose it after you find out how good you feel.
Mm-hmm. Well, somebody on YouTube asked, so the patient of Dr. Kline's, does that mean she was an addict? Does anyone that yawns?
Okay, that's an important distinction because everybody who takes opiates will become biochemically dependent. Now, dependent's a terrible word. So biochemically, a biochemical interaction between your body and the material, and that includes antidepressants, anticonvulsants, antipsychotic drugs, Valium, a long list of drugs cause biochemical interaction tolerance, so that when you stop them, you have a reaction. People who take Lasix, which is a diuretic, guess what? If they stop it abruptly, their legs swell up worse than they were in the beginning. So it's a funny phenomenon. It's called withdrawal and withdrawal reactions. So no, the lady on the IV drugs is not addicted because she's coming off, and she is not intensely seeking without consequence. She wants to feel good. She wants to have her pain relief, but that's different than intense seeking. Intense seeking would be she would pull out her IV and run down the street and try to find a dealer, but that's not the case. So no, not addicted. Becoming biochemically dependent and having withdrawal occurs in everybody who takes these drugs. And the worst withdrawals I've seen have been in antidepressants. It can take months.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but Dr. Kline, I have a question. How are you able to determine if somebody isn't just living a double life? Because I know a lot of people that live double lives that, just like Craig said, where they act and seem totally normal, and then you realize behind closed doors what they're doing behind your back or behind their family's back, So how do you know if this woman isn't going to the street, or after you wing her off, that she isn't running to friends to help her? You know what I mean? Like, how do you determine that?
It usually shows up, I think, because people become intensely seeking. See, that's the key. In other words, she may be intensely seeking on the street, and I would never find out about it. But if I treated her, I'd be arrested by the police, because I should have known is the policy they're using. But you're right. A lot of people can, get away with it and work as long as they have, a continuous supply. Like Craig was saying, he held a job, and but you can't always tell. I mean, it's kind of the old saw of AA. You got to come in and confess and say, you need help. But if you can hide it, I mean, there's a lot of socialites who have type 2 alcohol addiction where you need a constant blood supply, never leave their home, because they're not going to get any alcohol in 30 minutes. They're afraid, or they can't be drinking in the car. So what do? They stay home and they just kind of sip their wine a little. A lot of times they don't even get drunk.
Dr. Kline, what do people that struggle with addiction and have like a chronic rare disease or something, what do they do? Well,
both Kira, who stays away from it, and Craig, Craig had a method he told me about that when he needed treatment for a broken leg or something, his dad gave him the medicine. I thought that was really cool. In other words, you have to have two people. You have one person administering the pain medicine to the person with receptor disease. And yeah, and Kira knows that if she were to give in, that it would trigger the addiction again. That's the other thing. Type 2 addiction is a long-term chronic disease, and it can be easily triggered again. Whereas people with a cocaine addiction, ruins their life, they can just stop and the rest of their life is perfectly normal. But not for people with receptor disease. It's always there. So.
All right. Well, we're going to have to wrap up here soon. I wanted to know if, Craig, did you have anything else you wanted to share with the audience before we go?
Just one thing, Kira had an interesting point about, how would Dr. Kline know if this woman was an addict or not? And, to me, I guess the answer would be, if she's a really good actress and an addict or receptor disease, you wouldn't know. And so I think that the onus of responsibility then falls on the patient. In other words, I think it's so easy to blame the doctor all the time when they may not know. Literally, I mean, I while I was using heroin, I did break my hand. This is, I got a lot of injuries, but, and I went to the hospital and, they actually said it. And, I had done heroin right before I got into the emergency room. So I was feeling no pain whatsoever. And the doctor looked at me. He's like, doesn't that hurt? And I realized, I was like, oh my God, what do I say? I'm like, oh yeah, I feel the pressure, but it's not that bad. And he said, oh, wow, great. Then he leaves the room. Then he comes back. He's like, oh, I almost forgot to give you a prescription for Percocet. And my eyes, I tried to not let them light up, but I just, you always want any more opiate, and he's like, well, wait a second, you're not an addict, are you? And I said, oh, of course not. So that's not his fault. That's my fault. In other words, I was seeking that result and I got it. And then I had to pay the consequence for it. And so, I don't think that the receptor disease person, should be seen as like a victim. Because even though we, or I guess I'll speak for myself, have this disease, genetic, whatever you want to call it, I think ultimately, once I realize what's happening, it's up to me to be honest, when I realize I need help, I need to ask for it. I need to step up and be responsible. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not. And that's why a lot of people don't do it, because it's not easy. But
that's when they call it like rock bottom, hitting there,
Kira, do you have any final comments you'd like to make?
You
don't have to.
No, I'll just say if anybody is worried that they're getting addicted or they're going to go through withdrawal, there's tons of alternatives out there. Kratom, like I said earlier, Kratom and CBD are what I used to use to treat my pain when I was having my issues. So. Really, there's tons of alternatives if people are worried about it.
And as my final comment, listening to both of you, is in Canada, it is not illegal to treat addicts or receptor disease folks. You just go into the office and you say, I think I have addiction. The doctor talks to you and they say, well, let's get you started on some methadone or something. And there's no problem. In other words, Craig says the patient's responsibility. It's always the patient's responsibility. If somebody comes to me and has had chest pain in the middle of the night and started sweating, they need to tell me that. And if they have receptor disease, they need to say, Doc, I think I have receptor disease. But in our country, it's illegal for me to treat any type of heroin addiction. So there needs to be a relationship between doctors and patients that's not adversarial, and it's adversarial because the government has interfered with the doctor-patient relationship. So I really think it's great you both came on, and I've learned a lot, and that was kind of the purpose, was to get a better insight. And it's funny, isn't it, that we have this trillion-dollar war, and nobody asked the folks they're worried about, the people with receptor disease. Nobody interviewed. I've got 2,000 papers in my office here on pain and opiates, but there's and addiction disease. There's no paper I've run across where people were just interviewed, to gather information about this disease. In my mind, it's really like depriving people of insulin. It'd be the same thing if the government suddenly said, this insulin's really dangerous. You can die from it in the emergency room, which is true, by the way.
Well, we were talking about that earlier on YouTube.
Yeah, we're just going to ban it.
Yeah, well, you always say, Dr. Kline, one of the most important things you can do as a doctor is listen to your patient. Why aren't they, and people were saying, well, why don't we hear more from people that deal with addiction then? We don't hear about this. So you're right.
They're all afraid of the DEA. I mean,
right.
The DEA is really terrorizing. And it's not the DEA. We shouldn't blame the police. They're doing what they're told to do. And they're being told to do by the attorney generals. And it started with Sessions, is the attorney general, and the president. And they both said, go get those doctors.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are the purveyors of this radioactive material that's ruining our culture. So it's hard. We need to educate like we're doing tonight. We're starting. Yep. And we need to have attorney generals listen to medical lectures because they're not medical people. And we need to start this ball rolling and continue to look into it of the type 1 and type 2 addiction. That will make a big difference. 36 attorney generals believe that anyone could become addicted to heroin.
And we'll be doing that on Dr. Tom and the Dope Fiends. We'll have a few panelists, including you and another doctor, I believe, correct?
I hope so. Yeah. If we can find one who's not hiding under his desk.
And well, I'm going to wrap up here. Thank you, Kieran Craig, for joining us this evening and teaching us more about addiction. Appreciate you coming on. And I want to thank
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Good night.
I want to thank our audience for taking some time out of your evening to join us here on the Doctor's Corner for your daily dose of truth. I'm Jonelle Elgaway with Dr. Kline signing off until next Tuesday. Have a great evening.
This has been The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Jonelle Elgaway. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.